Dumbledore was, as always, full of surprises, though perhaps that depended on the person. Not everyone was Harry. When Eno first stepped into the office, he hadn't thought much of it, but the portraits snoozing in unison, their breathing a soft, steady rhythm, suggested that something else was at work. He had meant to wait a little longer, but when the hidden room revealed itself, any patience evaporated. No one in the castle could set a trap with quite such theatricality as the old headmaster. Eno halted when he heard a sound. "Professor, I'm curious, but I do have boundaries. This is your office. I won't be reckless." He stopped when he realized how the sentence sounded. Dumbledore's voice cut in with mock disappointment. "That's what I didn't expect. But now that you're here, aren't you curious?" Eno rubbed his temple. Pretending to be asleep had left him bleary-headed. It's as if he hadn't quite woken. Still, Dumbledore's hint left little room for refusal. "All right, I'm curious," he said as calmly as he could manage. "Excellent," Dumbledore chuckled, a smile lighting his face. "Come along." He led Eno through the concealed door. It was not, as Eno had half expected, a vast chamber of secrets. Instead, they entered a compact, deliberately furnished office that felt almost like a world unto itself. The walls and ceiling glowed a warm orange-red, bright and comforting, with veins of dark green woven through, slightly odd at first glance, but not enough to seem gaudy. The room was small, no more than 20 square meters, but every object spoke of an older Western classical taste. In the center stood a long pear-wood table, ornately carved, roughly 10 feet by 3, large enough that a troll could have lain on it and not filled the surface. Yet the table held surprisingly few items. A silver candelabrum, whose flames were no ordinary fire, but the goblet of fire itself, the so-called eternal flame, an unrolled, 2-foot-wide parchment, and a quill set in a dried inkwell. Eno didn't pay much heed to the eternal flame beyond the odd pleasure of recognition. He remembered vaguely that at Dumbledore's instruction Hagrid once carried such a torch to the giants, and it made for a welcome gift. His attention went straight to the parchment and quill. The scroll's axis seemed carved from obsidian, and set into its ends were 4 gems, red, yellow, blue, and green, each casting a soft, peculiar light. Fiery, profound, steady, calm. The colors braided in the air like threads of meaning. In Eno's mind, they suggested a panorama that reached back through time. He saw, as if in a dream, 4 remarkable witches and wizards in this very room more than 1,000 years ago, exchanging ideals and laying plans. If he had still been unable to guess what these items were, he would have been pretending. The 2 artifacts were unmistakable: the Book of Admittance and the Quill of Acceptance, the very bedrock of Hogwarts. Dumbledore, pleased by his reaction, moved behind the table and beckoned him closer. "I'm surprised," Eno admitted quietly. "Logically, I shouldn't be able to come here. Are you sure your head—" "Ha-ha! Quite sure." Dumbledore's laughter had the note of someone who'd been waiting a long time for a reveal. "People call me mad and unreliable, but most of the time my mind is very clear. This is one of those times." His expression grew serious. "Eno, you could have come here 2 years ago. Not only here, but anywhere in the castle. That ability didn't come from me, it comes from Hogwarts herself." At his invitation, Eno stepped forward. He studied the parchment and the quill with a mixture of reverence and scholar's curiosity. For a magical school, nothing was more essential than enrollment. Without the book and the quill, Hogwarts would be merely a castle. These 2 items watched the aisles. When a child's magic first stirred, the Quill of Acceptance would lift and scribe the name into the book, recording each new witch or wizard. When the book perceived his gaze, the nebula-like map of shifting color that covered the scroll faded, and lines of ink unfurled across the parchment in the 4 hues. Names appeared, written across the page in neat, ancient script: Rowena Ravenclaw, Godric Gryffindor, Felida Spore, Dilys Derwent, Phineas Black, Armando Dippet, Albus Dumbledore. Eno read down the list. The names were a roll call of the school's memory: founders, caretakers, famous alumnae, and wardens, written in the 4 colors that corresponded to the houses. He felt a light, sharp excitement at seeing Dumbledore's name there, written in red. Then, as if answering the attention in the room, a single name materialized in the blank space at the end of the scroll, ink pooling green and steady: Eno Swinburne, 302. Gradually, everything came together. Hogwarts, headmaster's office. On the sofa, Eno was still trying to digest what he had seen in the Chamber of Secrets. It had been sudden. His name had been entered in the Book of Admittance, even listed right after Dumbledore's. Given the famous names on that list, its significance was obvious. In the original timeline, the headship of Hogwarts had changed hands so often in recent years, from the ridiculous pink-toed Umbridge to Snape, and finally to a well-deserved Professor McGonagall. But what happened today had caught him completely off guard. Thinking that, Eno looked at Dumbledore across from him. "Professor, I'm only in my 4th year. Don't you think this decision is a little rash?" "Rash?" Dumbledore mused. "It seems you've misunderstood something. As I just said, it was Hogwarts itself that gave you the authority from beginning to end. Look at all these portraits. How many headmasters are recorded in Hogwarts' history?" Dumbledore pointed, and the portraits on the walls reacted, some rolling their painted eyes at the motion, others murmuring their disapproval. Even the short-tempered Phineas Black let out an irritable curse. In the past, Eno would have watched that scene with amusement. Now he thought it through. Since its founding in 990 AD, Hogwarts had recorded 17 headmasters, yet the list he'd seen and the portraits didn't match in number. Slowly the pieces fell into place. "Perhaps," he said aloud, "there are 2 kinds of headmasters, those chosen by the school itself and those appointed by wizards, the ministry, or the governors when the castle won't choose." "As I once told you," Dumbledore said, nodding, "no one can truly understand the castle. Not just because it hides countless secrets, but because the castle has its own will." He paused, then spread his hands with an oddly wistful look and added in a quieter voice, "And that's the key. Just as no one can fully understand another person, most of the time that person doesn't even fully understand themselves." Eno didn't answer immediately. He replayed the last few years in his head. His recent visit with Nicholas had left him thinking of magic as alchemy. If the castle was a living thing, an immensely powerful alchemical creation, much began to make sense. The long-lived sorting hat, the room of requirement behind the tapestry, the basilisk in the 2nd year. Each oddity could be explained as part of the castle's will. The extra puddle, the ghost blocking the way, the coincidences in the original story finally lined up. If he had suspected Dumbledore before, he had no doubt now. Most of it was the castle's doing. It would have been absurd to think the headmaster allowed a giant basilisk to run loose in the school just for some arrangement. Likewise, Slytherin would surely have hidden his chamber so that only certain heads could find it. Otherwise, the whole thing would be meaningless. He even thought of the Gaunt family journal. Did Lena find it in the restricted section because she searched for it, or because the castle allowed her to find it? After a long breath, Eno leaned back on the sofa and tapped the empty tea table with a finger. A glass of freshly squeezed grass juice materialized as if by command. This was not mere conjuring. This was an expression of the authority the headmaster could wield. In his 3 years at Hogwarts, Eno had seen countless professors go down to the Great Hall for meals, including heads of houses and deputies, but he had never seen Dumbledore preside in person. At first he'd assumed it was a scheduling matter, but now he suspected otherwise. The headmaster preferred his private meals. Seeing the thought on Eno's face, Dumbledore chuckled. "Sometimes I fill my stomach with sweets. Honeydukes is as irresistible as ever. Would you like some?" He rose and went to a cabinet, returning with 2 plates of sweets, one piled with snow-white cream fudge, the other covered in writhing sugared cockroaches. Eno's memory flashed back to the astronomy tower in his 1st year, the first time he'd been alone with Dumbledore and eagerly eaten a few extra pieces of fudge. Ever since, a plate of cream fudge had been the headmaster's quiet indulgence. "Thank you," Eno said, smiling as he took a piece. The taste was the same, creamy, comforting. Dumbledore returned the smile in silence. Time passed like water. When they'd finished the last of the sweets, Eno wiped the sugar from his mouth and said, "Professor, there's something I should tell you. On the train at the start of this year, Harry told me something. He said that before the holidays, Trelawney made a prophecy about him, that he would be the one to kill you." Dumbledore listened. At first, he showed no alarm, only a flicker of amused interest, as if he found the idea curious. The amusement faded into a look of compassion. "Sybil is like that. Every pronouncement a seer makes comes at a price. But this prophecy, being killed by Harry, that's odd, Dumbledore said, voice trailing. That's not odd at all, Eno interrupted. If you're killed by Harry, who will stand against Lord Voldemort? Hogwarts may have recognized me, but I don't have the strength to carry so many lives on my shoulders. When he mentioned Harry, he had deliberately emphasized his tone. What he meant was plain. If things played out as the prophecy suggested, Harry would likely not escape unscathed. The opponent was Voldemort. Hesitation could mean an end, like the one spoken of in prophecy. Sometimes the atmosphere of a conversation changes in an instant. After he finished speaking, Dumbledore fell silent, his face slowly folded into deep thought. Eno did not break that silence. After a long while, Dumbledore rose and went to the single cupboard in the headmaster's office where the sweets were kept. He opened it and two objects floated out. One was a foot-wide goblet with two handles, made of gold and finely carved with lively badgers along its surface. The other was much smaller, a roughly made ring, also golden, set with a dark, obsidian-like stone. Even without staring at them, Eno could feel a sharp, malicious aura clinging to both items. Your insight is admirable, Eno said, genuinely moved. Dumbledore, with only pieces of the story to go on, had traced Tom's contingencies one by one. It made him want to tell Tom, your professor will always be your professor. Dumbledore waved the compliment away. It's not hard to guess if you know him. Exceptional magical talent, good looks, excellent social sense, liked by everyone. Dumbledore's voice carried a faint regret, then shifted to a teasing tone. Honestly, you and Tom were very similar when you first arrived. So that's why you kept engineering those chance encounters? Eno half laughed. Yes, Dumbledore admitted with frankness. I deliberately sought you out every time, but it wasn't until your second year, when your name appeared in the Book of Admittance, that I saw the fundamental difference between you and Tom. Eno didn't interrupt this time. He straightened and listened. He could tell the main point was coming. Dumbledore sighed and changed the subject. Tom had an innate arrogance. He wouldn't choose mundane objects for Horcruxes, except that diary during his school days. After I saw Slytherin's locket, I formed a hypothesis. Dumbledore paused and noticed that Eno had vanished from his original spot. In a moment he reappeared, holding a beautifully crafted diadem encrusted with gems. Don't worry, I'm not stealing it. I'm borrowing it for a while. It still belongs to Hogwarts. Eno set the diadem on the coffee table between them. I trust you. That will never change, and neither will Hogwarts trust in you. Dumbledore waved his hand and turned his gaze back to the cup and the ring. What surprised me was that Tom would be insane enough to make 6 Horcruxes. Diary, locket, diadem, the golden cup, the ring, Harry. The list ran through Dumbledore's mind. Maybe even more than 6. He might not have known about Harry. After a moment, Eno revealed what the original timeline had held. According to the old story, the final Horcrux was created this year. Even so, with so much already changed, who could say whether Voldemort would still choose Nagini as a vessel? Eno deliberately avoided mentioning the snake. In matters like this, one careless guess could alter outcomes. More than 6, and unaware of Harry. Dumbledore frowned. The principal looked troubled. Eno felt helpless. Unlike the other Horcruxes, which left traces, the last one was the hardest to deduce. Time passed quietly as they thought. At last, Dumbledore spoke slowly. Eno, perhaps you're right. It seems Sybil's prophecy may be delayed for a long time. You're really prepared to sacrifice yourself to save Harry? Eno said, surprised, then understood the reasoning. In the original story, Harry had been forced into action. Now, with different circumstances, Dumbledore sacrificing himself might be the inevitable script. Dumbledore gave a faint smile, neither denying nor confirming. Late that night, Eno left the headmaster's office. The corridors were silent except for sleeping portraits and the gentle creak of moving staircases. The castle had settled into slumber. He replayed their conversation in his head, and when it came to Dumbledore's later arrangements and personal choices, he kept his opinions to himself. No one was immortal. Neither even Nicholas nor Perenelle had found true immortality. If he could, Eno wished Dumbledore a peaceful old age. More than half a century of remorse for youthful mistakes seemed to him more than enough penance. Time flowed on. After the opening feast, Hogwarts buzzed with excitement. The Tri-Wizard tournament dominated every conversation. Common rooms, corridors, even the Great Hall were alive with talk. The castle itself underwent a thorough spring cleaning. Portraits long untouched were taken down, wiped spotless, and rehung. Suits of armor lining the corridors were polished until they shone like mirrors. The Great Hall was refreshed with giant silk banners. The 4 house flags fluttered in the magically stirred air. There were other changes too, but one posted notice soon drew everyone's attention. In the 3rd week of term, under Professor McGonagall's supervision, Filch pinned a notice in the Great Hall. Bowsbittens and Durmstrang would arrive at Hogwarts this weekend. The announcement acted as a catalyst, sending the castle's excitement to a fever pitch. Not everyone shared that excitement. Eno's mind was elsewhere. He was fixated on the Valley of the Sanctuary. The magic beans that had sprouted the previous year had finally borne fruit after a full year. With the Harvest Festival at the end of September approaching, they were beginning to yield their gifts. At the start of the month, Xiao Di was already asking for tickets, imploring everyone to vote. Xiao Di's sharing today. Poltergeists, or noisy ghosts, are spirits from European folklore known for causing loud disturbances. They usually have no fixed form. Habits. Poltergeists tend to appear in particular places, especially where many teenagers gather, sometimes arising with the construction of certain buildings or moving in quietly at specific times. Muggle homes can also be host to poltergeists. Abilities. They can fly and enjoy pranks, loosening chandeliers, writing insults on blackboards, and throwing objects about. 304. The Harvest of the Harvest Festival. 3 gifts. A valley full of flowers could always coax out a quiet peace from people's hearts. In the broad sanctuary valley, a small white house stood like a shard of marble. Opposite the house, 3 10-foot oak trees rose in a neat row. Under them, a small stool held a young man who was endlessly flipping through a book. "This is utterly ridiculous," Eno muttered, staring at the 7 books in his hands. The magic beans given by the Grimm brothers had sprouted last year and seemingly overnight had become 10-foot oaks. A year of careful tending later, the 3 trees had finally produced gifts. It was something to celebrate. His work had paid off. But Eno's curiosity would not be satisfied by surprise alone. He had gone to London and, with Corvus's help, bought different editions of Grimm's fairy tales from foils. No one had noticed. From 1812 to 1864, the collection had been reprinted 17 times, 7 full editions, and 10 simplified versions for children. And even among the 7 full editions, the contents varied. Heaven knows how many stories are hiding in there. He set the book down and looked at the 3 oaks. The first tree sparkled, where leaves had been replaced by a riot of gemstones, moonstones with opalescent halos, aquamarines and topazes, vivid pigeon blood rubies, deep cornflower sapphires, and emerald green savorites. The second tree seemed unnaturally alive for autumn. Its leaves were greener than summer, and among them hung delicate hand lamps, no larger than a palm, each burning with a steady blue flame. The third tree looked ordinary at a distance, except for a clear crystal ball suspended in its branches. At first glance, it could have been any divination orb sold in Diagon Alley for 7 sickles. Nothing about it shouted magic. And that plainness was the root of Eno's current dilemma. The first 2 gifts were easy to identify. The gemstones were obvious. The blue hand lamps, after cross-referencing the tales, matched the blue lantern, a lamp that could summon a house elf. Not an all-powerful wish-granting genie, but an obedient servant able to do many small tasks without fear of treachery. Eno had long wanted a house elf, especially now that the valley was full of herbs. A small, careful assistant would be perfect. The troll and the goblin could handle heavy labor, but delicate work required finesse. The blue lantern seemed a blessing. The crystal ball, though, refused to be read. It bore no distinctive sigils or features. If it had a story behind it, that story lay buried. Still, the uncertainty would only last a day or 2. Although the gifts hung from the trees immediately, Eno had decided to collect them on the day of the Harvest Festival. It wasn't a Muggle sense of ritual that restrained him. Rather, mysterious things often honored rites. Waiting an extra day or 2 could matter. On the last Sunday of September at dawn, Eno opened his eyes in the Slytherin dormitory and sat up. He did not pull back his curtains. For a moment he gathered himself, then vanished from his bed. In the valley of the sanctuary, he reappeared, greeted by a faint blue-purple horizon and the pale east light lifting the air. The scent of the plants and flowers chased away the last of his sleep. "Harvest festival. Time to harvest," he whispered, and walked towards the oaks. Approaching the trees, he felt glad he'd delayed. The gifts had not changed, but the oaks now gave off a clear, ripening grain fragrance, a faint, fresh scent of rice that cleansed the mind as if the world had been washed. He steadied himself and reached for the second tree. Beneath the glossy leaves, a blue lantern hung quietly. It was small enough to fit in an adult's palm, with a brass body that shimmered with a cool metallic sheen. The lampshade wasn't ordinary glass, but something like a transparent protective film, thin as a cicada wing, that shivered with the blue flame inside. The flame itself lacked the heat and flashiness of ordinary fire. It flickered like paint on a canvas, graceful and unreal. He plucked it as one picks an apple, the branch yielding with a gentle snap. The moment the lantern left the tree, the blue flame fluttered and a small figure leapt out from the light. "Master, Blue Lantern awaits your command." The little being landed and bowed. It was startling in a way that made sense. The stories had always unfolded like this. The figure was about 2 feet tall, human in shape, but with unnatural, ghostly blue skin. He wore a robe the color of aged brass. There was something strange about him, but not unpleasant. "I want a sumptuous breakfast," Eno said calmly. He asked for something simple on the face of it. In truth, he was testing the lantern. Inside the sanctuary, his phoenix could not come and go without his permission. So for the blue lantern to produce food, there were only 2 possibilities. It could either transform things that already existed in the valley, or it could conjure food out of thin air, as in the tales. The former would be unsurprising. The latter would mean the lantern's power was far more remarkable and somewhat terrifying. 305. Excellent servant in Shelter Valley. Eno watched the breakfast in front of him with interest. A freshly baked flour cake, warm toast, crisp biscuits, and a glass of honeyed water with a hint of olive. The spread looked exquisite, but it also confirmed Blue Lantern's limitations. He followed the magic world's rules. "I'm very sorry, Master. There weren't many ingredients available here, so this is all I could make," Blue Lantern said, bowing his head slightly. Embarrassed. "It's all right. This is enough," Eno replied. He wasn't offended. On the contrary, he found it reassuring. If Blue Lantern could truly break the rules of magic, it would make him uneasy. "From now on, your task is to manage the herbs in the valley. I'll send you books on the specifics when the time comes. For now, go water them." As he spoke, Blue Lantern bowed again, his form growing faint and transparent until he vanished. A thin, dark cloud gathered over the valley, and a steady, fine drizzle began. "So it really is wizard-level magic," Eno muttered. The cloud proved his guess. Blue Lantern's ceiling was probably comparable to a wizard. He couldn't conjure food from nothing, but he could call forth clean water. With over 100 acres to cover, watering would take a while. Eno glanced at the cloud, then turned to the other 2 oak trees. He plucked a crystal orb about 7 inches across. Like the tree it had grown from, the orb seemed unremarkable, no reaction when he held it, like a muggle trinket. Still, he wrapped it carefully away, remembering a joke. If you find a glass bead in a box of gold, it's probably a gem you don't recognize. The unassuming crystal could be more than it seemed. The last harvest was a whole tree hung with dazzling gems. Eno didn't use magic. He picked them one by hand, like a true farmer. It wasn't sentimentality. Harvest rituals often stand for diligence and simplicity, and he preferred not to take shortcuts. Half an hour later, he'd collected a small mountain of jewels. He'd meant to count them precisely, but after a while he stopped caring. Roughly 100 or 2, he guessed. He was genuinely pleased. Gems in the magical world were more useful than gold. Potions, alchemy, and some rare stones were priceless. Harvest always brought a simple joy. After sorting his spoils, Eno watered the 3 oaks and looked forward to next year's yield. He picked up the breakfast Blue Lantern had prepared, making sure not to waste it. Hunger was a lesson he'd learned too well, and with a flicker, he disappeared from the valley. Slytherin Dormitory. Draco, freshly washed and awake, found food laid out on the table. The presentation was elegant, and the floral scent made his mouth water. "Is this something new from the kitchens?" he asked. "It wasn't from the kitchens. I bought it outside." "Help yourself," Eno answered, half leaning on the bed and watching Draco's reactions with a practiced, easy eye. "Then I won't be polite," Draco declared, and immediately seized a flour cake. The quiet dormitory filled with the sound of someone devouring breakfast. After 2 cakes and a few biscuits, he wiped his mouth, already wanting more. "Eno, the Durmstrang delegation might arrive this afternoon, but before that, I want to go to Hogsmeade. Want me to bring you anything?" Eno hesitated, his thoughts still on the oak trees and the goblet of fire soon to be lit. Then he remembered Blue Lantern managing the herbs. "Bring me 1,000 magical herbs and fungi," he said, "and if there's time, some cream toffees from Honeydukes." "Consider it done. I'll be back before noon," Draco said with a puffed-up confidence. He didn't wonder why Eno wanted a duplicate textbook. 10 minutes later, Draco left in high spirits, and the plate of flour cakes vanished with him. Eno hadn't even touched a cleaning charm when the bedside drawer gave a small vibration. Astronomy tower, possibly the loneliest spot at Hogwarts. Except during evening astronomy classes, the tower by day was quieter than Snape's potion office. Morning sunlight spilled over the summit. Hermione stood alone at the battlements in a plain witch's robe, her silhouette gilded by the sun. At her feet were a pair of khaki ankle boots, one foot planted, the other tipped on its toe, the slender toe idly nudging the ancient stone wall. After a while of standing and looking bored, she walked to the edge and rested her hands on the cold parapet, gazing out toward the forbidden forest. She didn't notice the faint orange-red shimmer that suddenly moved through the stillness. With a soft, silent flare, Phoenix apparition left no sound, Eno appeared on the tower. The scene before him looked like a carefully painted oil canvas. Hermione leaning on the battlements, sunlight gilding each strand of her slightly wavy, shoulder-length brown hair. Everything was beautiful, but beneath the beauty, Eno felt a trace of loneliness. It reminded him of a morning 3 years earlier, sitting by the Thames with a cheap breakfast and watching boats go by. A lively scene, yet profoundly solitary. A stranger in a strange place, that's how it felt. For the first time, Eno thought Hermione had never fully fit into Hogwarts. Unlike the original tale, where the trio's adventures cemented their bonds, in this version, Hermione remained alone. 4 years in, and the proud, brilliant girl still seemed like an outsider in Gryffindor. 306, delayed talent time rewound 20 minutes. After Draco left, Eno was about to cast a cleaning charm on the dishes when the two-way mirror on the bedside drawer vibrated. Connecting to it transported him to the astronomy tower. "Hermione!" someone called softly, breaking the tower's silence. Hermione turned, surprised, her face lighting up with an irrepressible smile. "Eno, I'm sorry to disturb your weekend, but there's something I need to give you, something that might help." She walked briskly toward him. "Don't worry about it. I don't sleep in on weekends either." Eno waved a hand and flicked his wand at the stone floor. 2 wicker armchairs and a small coffee table quietly appeared in the astronomy tower. "Sit and talk," Hermione urged. "You probably haven't had breakfast yet." He sat while Hermione rummaged through her pockets. Eno glanced at the coffee table. It had been empty a minute ago. Now it was heaped with bottles and vials. Draught of peace, fire-making potion, elixir of euphoria, calming draught, forgetfulness potion, skelegro, antidote to common poisons, shrinking solution, reviving potion, a whole pile of remedies and curiosities. Potions wasn't Eno's specialty, and even he could tell this was an impressive assortment. Where had a 4th-year witch acquired so many? If he didn't know the original timeline, he might have speculated wildly about Hermione's background. Then the assortment shifted, more exotic, more dangerous-looking bottles replacing the previous ones. Draught of living death, veritaserum, confusing concoction, potion of despair. After a moment, it seemed Hermione had emptied her family's entire stock. Just as Eno was trying to take it all in, she did something else. Her fingers reached into her collar and produced a silver-white chain. At the end of it hung a small bottle of gold, shimmering liquid, Felix Felicis. Eno's eyebrows shot up. Unlike the others, Felix Felicis couldn't simply be bought. It depended on connections and extraordinary luck. Only a handful of potion masters in the wizarding world could brew it, and as soon as a vial reached the market, potion shops snapped it up. He'd even discussed Felix Felicis with Lucius once. Lucius had once given him a small bottle, and they'd agreed on the same thing. It never just circulated freely. Looking at the table and the bottle at Hermione's throat, Eno's curiosity flared. There was no way she'd come by so many rare things by chance. Hermione, you. I brewed them myself, Hermione answered before he could finish. She tilted her head, a little smug and very pleased, the pale curve of her neck catching the light. She looked proud, but also like someone hoping for approval. Incredible, Eno said without reservation. He realized that in the original story, Hermione had been underestimated. Her real talent might not be rote learning or a future in the ministry. Perhaps she was a natural-born potions master. He thought of the story from the books. A young witch relying on a restricted library text managed, secretly and on her first try, to brew a complicated draught. The detail fit oddly well here. Hermione brightened at the praise. But the Felix Felicis, Eno asked, his gaze fixed on the golden vial clutched in her fingers. Hermione's smile faltered. She lowered her gaze and then, a little shyly, said, "That one isn't mine." She hurried on, however. "I can brew Felix Felicis, really. I'll be able to, if I had 6 months in a cauldron, but I couldn't bring the cauldron home." Eno felt a sudden warmth. The wizarding world was strange. Some people spent their lives mastering just one charm, while others, still in their 4th year, were already working at the level of top potion masters. Brewing Felix Felicis really was a milestone, the point beyond textbook learning, where you stopped following instructions and started inventing, the road to becoming a true potions master. "Hermione, your talent with potions is impressive," he said. She didn't melt into smugness this time. Instead, she put the Felix Felicis back against her throat and pushed the pile of vials toward him. "All of these are for you. I don't know what you'll need exactly, but injuries always happen in the Tri-Wizard tournament." Her voice was earnest, and her eyes were sincere. Eno was unexpectedly moved. Even if some of this was driven by misunderstanding or an information gap, the feeling behind it was real. People loved the honor of glory, but few saw the hardships behind it. He thought of the first scene, the lone figure in the astronomy tower, and he understood in a small way that beneath the neat little bottles lay countless small sacrifices. There wasn't time to share all the details today. The chapter was already late. Finally, Xiaodi asks for votes. Rob the ballot box. At the top of the astronomy tower, the transfiguration table was bare. The potions had long since been put away and replaced with freshly baked flour cakes and cups of honeyed water. Hermione had produced a stack of bottled draughts, Veritaserum, Skelegro, and the like, and at first, Eno had no intention of taking them. He had no plans to enter the Tri-Wizard business. But when he saw the hopeful look in her eyes, he accepted a few of the less popular bottles. He still didn't know where Hermione had obtained the ingredients. He decided that after he gathered the valley herbs, he would pack everything up and send them out at Christmas, since he had no better use for them. Once the potions were stored, the tea table began to look empty. Remembering Hermione's earlier complaint about an empty stomach, Eno absent-mindedly called for the blue lantern. To his surprise, the little being appeared. The blue lantern was like a tiny fire-spawned elf, 2 feet tall, bright, and somehow not bound by the sanctuary's usual restrictions. Eno suspected why. The lantern's true form was the lamp hung in the valley of the sanctuary. The lamp itself had not left, and perhaps for that reason, the blue lantern could slip through the barriers and manifest at Hogwarts. Hermione had watched it all in silence. After the blue lantern served the cakes and the honey water and vanished, she asked quietly, "What was that? I've never read anything like it." Eno hesitated a moment to arrange his words. "You can think of it as a creature I created, something like a spirit or a magical being, similar to a phoenix. Have you read Mr. Newt Scamander's articles?" Hermione brightened. "Newt Scamander? His piece was in today's Transfiguration. I didn't expect you to have created something like that. Besides the phoenix, I mean." Hermione's voice, even at 14, had grown more assured, no longer the high, hurried tone of a younger girl, but calm and magnetic. She talked about phoenixes, about their rebirth, their tears, their affinity for healing, and Eno let her. Hermione could talk until her words ran dry when she cared about a subject. The flow of information was pleasant but fast. Eno felt a little overwhelmed by the torrent of facts, yet he knew Hermione's nature. She wasn't a chatterbox so much as someone who, given the right topic, simply could not stop. Hermione, have you ever seen a phoenix? He asked, cutting in. Her attention snapped to him. Taking advantage of the pause, he called, Corvus. An orange-red shape glided into the tower air and landed easily on his shoulder. You brought me a lot of potions, so I brought a gift, Eno said. The phoenix cocked her head and, almost as if on cue, plucked a perfect feather with her slender beak. If you find yourself in danger, set this feather alight with magic and Corvus will come, Eno told Hermione, pushing the feather toward her. Hermione's gaze, however, was fixed not on the feather, but on Corvus herself. Her eyes were gentle and full of affection. Eno smiled quietly. He had no doubts about his bird's effect on people. Corvus carried both healing and rebirth in her nature, and her pure presence was hard to resist. Do you want to hold her? He asked after a moment. He had noticed just then a shadow of loneliness in Hermione's posture. To muggles it might be nothing, but for a witch or wizard, emotional anchors mattered. Magic clung to feeling. A child who lived too long without fitting in could find that something inside them fraying. Hermione's face lit with surprise and delight. May I? Eno nodded and looked to Corvus. The phoenix gave a soft click, and an orange warmth bloomed across Hermione's arms. She reached out, fingers trembling a touch, and laid her hand on the bird. There was no struggle, just a gentle, careful contact, the way one would handle something precious. For Hermione, it was a small, private ceremony, an expression of joy, a little bit of disbelief, then a reverent tenderness. The sight stirred something in Eno. It reminded him briefly of a shabby orphanage at Christmas, the hush of children who could hardly believe a gift was really for them. An expression of delicate, stunned happiness transformed into careful touch. But Hermione wasn't thinking of that. As she cradled Corvus, the warmth seemed to settle into her chest. The long nights of reading, the solitary hours brewing potions in abandoned classrooms, the small humiliations and triumphs, all those memories softened, appearing like framed pictures hung in a better light. Eno watched the change. It wasn't something visible. It was a subtle settling, a reshaping of emotion and the way magic attached to memory. He had seen it once before with Pansy, the way feelings could condense and become steadier, the way magic could be steadied by an anchor. Corvus, he realized, worked like a living psychologist. She helped sort out tangled feelings and steady a young witch's magic. The truth of her name, healer and reborn, fit. Thinking of Corvus next to Hermione, it was inevitable that his thoughts slid to Fide, his other phoenix. He imagined a comic little scene, a second child born to a family, a younger sister suddenly the favorite, and the firstborn brother, Fide, packing his things with his beak and flying off into the sunset, offended. The image almost made him laugh. Under the laughter, though, a more serious realization settled in. His two phoenixes were unusual. Lucius Malfoy had once come into close contact with Fide and had been nearly undone by the experience. Similarly, now that Hermione held Corvus, she experienced corresponding magical effects. It wasn't quite right to call them miracles in the usual sense, but they were extraordinary. He tipped through the memory like a scholar. Fide's origin traceable to the arid continent, Corvus's to Middle-earth, places outside the ordinary magical world. That neither place had obvious ties to wizarding society explained some of their strangeness. Still, allegiance mattered more than origin. Whatever their nature, both birds remained bound to him. A small, practical idea nudged at the back of his mind. Perhaps Hogwarts might one day establish a counseling room. Perhaps Corvus could even be given a post. The thought of the phoenix with a salary made him smile. 308. Ron's Show-Off. The last weekend of September, 1994. At the top of the astronomy tower, Eno waited until nearly noon before slipping a quiet goodbye to Hermione. They had talked for hours that morning. He hadn't been bored at all. If anything, time had flown. That afternoon, the Great Hall buzzed louder than usual. A notice had gone up announcing that students and professors from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang would be visiting Hogwarts before 6 o'clock. Even though it was the weekend, nobody wanted to miss it. Hogsmeade trips were abandoned in favor of the spectacle. At the Gryffindor table, Ron finished his meal in a hurry and brimmed with energy. "Harry, did you hear? They've already picked the champion." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The young wizards within a 10-meter radius slowed their eating to listen. Ron, ever the gossip-monger, noticed the attention and nodded with satisfaction. Before he could add more, Dean Thomas piped up with the usual objection. Here we go again. If the professors have pre-selected champion, I'm not going to watch this so-called Tri-Wizard tournament. Seamus, who sat next to Dean, murmured, just let him talk. There's nothing else to do. The five-boy dormitory dynamic played out perfectly. Dean, who couldn't stand Ron, contradicting him. Seamus, closer to Dean, but friendly enough with Ron to keep the peace. Ron ignored Dean's rebuttal. This wasn't their dormitory, and he already had an audience. He glanced at Harry and lowered his voice for dramatic effect. Harry, I've got secret information. They say the professors let it slip. He spoke like someone giving a speech, and a small salon of gossip formed around him. Elsewhere in the Great Hall, groups of 2 to a dozen argued about who would be Hogwarts champion. Each house hoped one of their own would be chosen, but 2 names came up most often, Eno and Cedric. Cedric, after 6 years at the school, had plenty of prestige. Most of it was confined to Hogwarts, but that was more than enough. The mood in Slytherin, however, was muted. After Draco's careless spreading of information, they had all come to the same conclusion. Eno was very unlikely to enter the Tri-Wizard tournament. Reason said he was right. An Order of Merlin award was a higher honor than the tournament's glory, but sentiment still left the Slytherins feeling a small loss. Lunch wound down amid the noise and low spirits. By 4 in the afternoon, the castle was mostly empty. No reminders from the prefects were even necessary. No one wanted to miss the visiting schools. On the lawn by the Black Lake, Professor McGonagall had been waiting at the appointed spot for some time. To mark the reception's formality, she wore a freshly pressed robe and a pointed hat, every detail exact. From a distance, she looked imposing and elegant. A tidy procession of young witches and wizards stood by the lake, led by an elderly witch, quiet and composed. But as murmurs began in the crowd, decorum frayed. Discussion rose, cautious at first, then increasingly loud and unrestrained. Quiet! Line up! Prefects! Keep them in order! Professor McGonagall's voice, amplified by magic, reached every ear. Her tone carried annoyance. It had the desired effect. Under her reprimand, the students huddled obediently, like puffskeins. She turned her head and peered across the water again, inwardly irritated by the cause of her vexation. The Order of Merlin. They had to schedule it in October. Those rigid old fogies, she muttered under her breath. For generations, the 3 great European schools had competed, overtly or otherwise, and the Tri-Wizard tournament had always been a way to determine a nominal leader through measured contest. The news that Eno might miss the tournament because of an Order of Merlin ceremony in October had reached McGonagall. She found it deeply annoying. The murmurs started up again behind her. Quiet, everyone, she called out once more, and the students fell silent. Unlike McGonagall, the other 3 deans, including Dumbledore, remained calm and silent. The pattern was tiresomely predictable. Every 15 minutes, McGonagall's voice would rise to restore order. 1 reprimand for 15 minutes of peace. After 6 cycles, an hour and a half had passed. It's 5:40. Do you think they'll be late? If they are, that'll be funny, Ron said, checking his pocket watch with eager anticipation. He kept the watch out even while talking, as if showing it off. It was a finely made mechanical watch with a thumbnail-sized red ruby set into its face. The gem flashed now and then. In the crowd, George and Fred exchanged embarrassed looks. I told him to give him 2 sickles and send him on his way, Fred grumbled. You insisted on giving him 2 galleons. How was I supposed to know he'd be like this? George replied. He won't get another nut from me. Both brothers turned away, awkward at Ron's ostentation. They regretted their generosity after the World Cup, watching him parade the watch. Across the lawn, in the Slytherin group, Draco pulled out his own pocket watch, only to glance at it and slip it back into his pocket. Eno, do you think they'll be late? He asked, directing the question toward his companion. All things change. Matters are always in flux. Just as Draco was asking about the other 2 schools, a commotion rose from the crowd. Look at the sky. What is it? Flying horses. What flying horses? Those are Beauxbatons Abraxons, dim-witted as goblins. With the murmurs, more and more young wizards lifted their heads. A black dot in the distance was closing in at an incredible speed, and soon the enormous shape became clear. A carriage the size of a small house, lavishly decorated, its doors inlaid with gems that, when seen closely, formed an emblem, two wands crossed. But no one cared about the ornamentation. Every eye was fixed on the creatures drawing the carriage. They were giant winged horses, abraxans, so huge they seemed more like African elephants with horse-like features. Nearly 15 feet tall, they looked majestic and terrifying. Their teacup-sized eyes were an eerie blood red. 12 of the colossal beasts flew toward the students by the Black Lake, and those in the front rows backed away in panic, as if retreat were the only way to avoid being trampled. Rubus Hagrid, the Care of Magical Creatures professor, stepped forward. His bulk, almost as imposing as the Abraxans, felt reassuring to many who usually laughed at him. He held two warning signs the size of dining tables, waving them like Muggle airport ground staff. Under his guidance, the horses altered course. With a thud and a shudder through the ground, the house-sized carriage came to rest at a safe distance. The carriage door was pushed open from within. A student in a blue robe leapt down, waved a wand at the carriage pole, and a golden, ornate staircase unfurled. The display opened many young eyes. After all, not everyone could inlay carriage doors with jewels and produce a staircase of gold. Across Europe, only Beauxbatons could afford such extravagance. They had illustrious alumni, including the famed alchemy master Nicholas Flamel. As the golden stairs extended, a large foot in diamond-studded high heels appeared, followed by a woman stepping down whose height rivaled Hagrid's. 15 feet tall, about 4.5 meters, she dominated the scene. Despite this enormous stature, she was the very picture of elegance, dignified, smiling, graceful in every gesture. From any angle, she was perfect in etiquette. Eno let his gaze sweep across the Hogwarts faculty, the plump Professor Pomona, the eccentric and disheveled Trelawney, the academic ancient runes instructor Professor Babbling, the ethereal astronomy Professor Sinistra, and even Madame Hooch. At that moment, only Professor McGonagall seemed properly presentable beside the Beauxbatons' arrival. Dumbledore stepped forward with his usual smile. The headmaster, normally tall, looked comparatively small beside the towering woman, yet he still took her hand and performed a formal hand kiss. Though supremely polite, the gesture looked comic from where they stood. Her single hand nearly covered his cheek. Their voices were too low for most of the crowd to catch, and attention shifted immediately after. The carriage door swung open again, and this time 10 students alighted, mostly girls, each about 16 or 17, bright-eyed, composed, carrying a faint perfume as they walked. French elegance seemed to stream from them. When French ladies met English gentlemen, Ron was a model example. Cheeks flushed, hands awkward, eyes pretending to look ahead but repeatedly straying. Many of the 14 and 15-year-old boys were much the same. Time slipped on. As dusk fell, Hogwarts welcomed its final guests, Durmstrang from the north. Their arrival stirred a different kind of excitement, not just for the dramatic entrance across the Black Lake, but because Durmstrang had brought their famous seeker, Victor Krum. Had Professor McGonagall not kept a close watch, the area outside the castle would have become a small autograph session. Wizards loved Quidditch to their core. Krum's presence earned Durmstrang deep respect. Their headmaster, Karkaroff, looked every bit proud, tilting his head and scanning the crowd with an air of arrogance. "He seems a bit full of himself," Draco muttered in the Slytherin ranks, pouting. Many Slytherins shared his displeasure. Quidditch prestige mattered to them in a way it didn't elsewhere. "Forget it, or do you want him to make a fool of himself?" Eno replied casually. He didn't care for those shallow contests of pride, but Karkaroff's boasting put a crooked thought into his head. If the Goblet of Fire picked Ron, perhaps he would arrange for the other side to win the cup. There was nothing more humiliating than losing the tournament, and worse still was to come in last. As Eno mulled over the idea of cheating, he didn't notice the flash in Draco's eyes. Hearing mention of making Karkaroff look foolish had struck a mischievous chord in the boy. After too much time with the Weasley twins in the Mirror of Erised, Draco's expression had become a perfect mimic of their impish glee. Please vote. Today's little aside, Abraxan. I may have mentioned them before, but here's the summary again. Abraxan. Appearance: a breed of winged horses, huge and powerful, with wings, usually pale coat and white manes, and blood-red, teacup-sized eyes. Habits: Madame Maxime's Abraxans reportedly only drink pure malt whiskey, and only very strong people can handle them. It's unconfirmed whether all Abraxans share this trait. Abilities and uses: Abraxans are used to draw carriages in flight. 310. Argument in the auditorium. It was late September in the Scottish Highlands. Because of its latitude, twilight fell early. By 6 in the evening, it was already edging toward dark. But the dim sky did nothing to dampen the excitement of the Hogwarts students. Whether by design or habit, Crumb stood in the front row, only a half step from Igor Karkaroff. Gasps and cheers rippled through the crowd as the tall, thin, goat-bearded Durmstrang headmaster squinted and adopted an air of smug superiority. Hogwarts! This place is truly wonderful. I really regret not coming sooner, Karkaroff drawled, dragging out the words. But it's not too late. Hogwarts welcomes us. Now please follow me to the Great Hall. Madame Maxime is already waiting. Dumbledore kept smiling, entirely unfazed by Karkaroff's posturing, like a phoenix that had no interest in lowering itself to examine a flobberworm. The students could barely make out the conversation between the two heads, but Karkaroff's arrogant expression was plain for everyone to see. Draco found it tedious. He reached into his pocket and, when he withdrew his hand, a palm-sized frisbee appeared quietly in his palm. Before he could do anything else, a firm hand closed on his wrist. Are you mad? If you make a scene here, we'll be the ones humiliated. Eno sounded helpless, but reasonable. He disliked Karkaroff's arrogance as much as anyone, but he still had a sense of proportion. Making a spectacle of the Durmstrang headmaster here would only show that Hogwarts lacked hospitality. Whether Karkaroff would be embarrassed was secondary. The whole school would be laughed at across Europe. I'm not mad, Draco insisted. We'll wait until it's darker. We'll be away from the crowd before he goes into the castle. No one will suspect it was us. It was a tempting chance, but Draco had overlooked one thing. Dumbledore was walking beside Karkaroff. Even if neither intervened, a tangible object would leave a trace. The appearance of the frisbee would still implicate Hogwarts. Thinking this through, Eno slipped the frisbee from Draco's hand and pocketed it, then looked around. More precisely, he looked toward the Gryffindor table. After a moment's pause, he confirmed what he already suspected. In the whole school, the only student bold enough to try something like that was Draco. Marcus had graduated. Among the Slytherin students of the Sacred 28, most were either from minor branches or from families in decline. The one who still had the confidence to stir trouble was probably only Draco Malfoy. Harry might have been another candidate, but his attention kept flicking toward Ravenclaw, and no one could tell what he was looking at. Draco didn't sulk over his frisbee being confiscated. It had been a passing whim. As boredom set in, a familiar voice reached his ear. Draco, have you ever thought about becoming a champion, winning the Triwizard Cup? Eno had entertained the idea himself at one point, but the thought of a year full of complications and risks quickly put him off. Not everything needed to be a spectacle. Become a champion? Draco said, understanding the implication. If anyone else had offered, he would have refused on principle, too dangerous. But hearing it from Eno made him pause. Don't answer now. We can talk in the dormitory tonight. Eno patted Draco's shoulder. It had been a spur-of-the-moment idea. In the original plan, Bardi could have used a Confundus charm to tamper with the Goblet of Fire. By mimicking that, they could get Draco's name taken, which would satisfy Slytherin's pride. As they spoke, Eno strolled into the castle. Clearly, there was no feast tonight. No professor or prefect had announced one, so the students had free time. Outside the Great Hall, Eno glanced inside, frowned, then glanced instinctively toward the corridor leading down to the dungeons. Are you going back to the dormitory? I'll bring you something to eat later, Draco offered, noticing the small change in his friend. No need. I've got flour cakes, Eno said, declining the offer, and turned away. Draco straightened his robes and swept into the Great Hall with a deliberate, showy stride until he saw someone even more theatrical than himself. Though it was the Slytherin table across from him, Ron was behaving like he was back at the Burrow, loud, confident, and utterly at ease. Just 10 points short, Ron called out to the hall. And you can't blame Crumb. He did brilliantly. It's not the game's fault or the player's fault. It must be the coach's. He kept glancing at Crumb, and when Crumb returned the look with a smile, Ron grew even more animated. Draco pushed through the crowd and swaggered up to him. If I'm not mistaken, you're trespassing on Slytherin territory, Draco sneered. And you, well, the poor man's, Scarhead's poor little sidekick. He faltered mid-insult and altered his words. Somehow Draco still had a knack for saying the exact wrong thing. Old habits died hard. The remark caught Harry's attention, and he flared up instantly. It wasn't the nickname Scarhead that bothered him so much as the word sidekick. Harry had learned a lot with age. Calling Ron someone's sidekick was more than mockery. It was a jab meant to undermine their friendship. Before Ron could reply, Harry stepped in. Poor? You don't know the half of it. Ron's loyalty, bravery, sense of humor, his family, those aren't things you can measure in galleons. Harry's sudden defense stunned Draco, and for a heartbeat Ron, who had never thought of his own qualities in those terms, felt oddly buoyed. Ginny, standing nearby, watched with admiration. Her eyes literally sparkled. Excellent? Beyond imagination? Draco scoffed, but his composure returned quickly. He let the mockery sharpen, deliberately provocative. In that case, Mr. Red-Haired Sidekick, Mr. Scarhead, dare you put money on that? A bet right now? Do you have the nerve? There was a hint of calculation behind Draco's challenge, and before Harry could think it through, Ron answered for him. What do you want to bet on? Fine, I'll take you up on it. 311, wandless and silent casting. What do you want to bet? I'll see it through to the end. Realizing he had become the center of attention in the Great Hall, Ron's confidence swelled. Good, very good. This is exactly what Scarhead calls excellent. Draco gave Ron a faint, sly compliment, then paused before continuing. Since you're so excellent, becoming a Hogwarts champion should be a piece of cake for you. 2 sentences of praise and a shove were all it took for Draco to pin Ron into a corner. The onlookers watched with keen interest, especially the Slytherin table. The little snakes were silent, waiting for Ron's answer. If Ron admitted it, they would embellish the story to the hilt. If he refused, they would make sure the whole castle knew how a Gryffindor had been pushed around. As someone who understood how gossip worked in Hogwarts, Ron knew the trap, and that any answer would be perilous. Harry felt guilty too. He'd egged Ron on, and with Ron's usual caution, he wouldn't have been so reckless today. Harry was still floundering when a clear voice rang out from the crowd. Ron is a Gryffindor. So who else do you have? Are you really hoping a Gryffindor becomes champion? If that's the case, I have nothing to say. Ginny stepped forward without hesitation. Her reasoning was sharp and impossible to argue with. She hadn't meant to get involved. Malfoy hadn't even mentioned the Weasleys, but seeing Harry's worried look made her speak up. Her words diffused the moment. The commotion in the Great Hall, however, didn't reach the castle's underground. Down in the Slytherin dormitory, it was quiet. On a round beechwood table sat a few simple treats, a plate of flour cakes, bits of butterscotch wrapped in parchment, and a few biscuits, small things Blue Lantern had baked. Hogwarts never lacked ingredients, but Eno didn't want to help himself. Taking without permission would be stealing, even if the kitchens held plenty. Besides, certain things were about principle, not quantity. In that case, maybe a vegetable garden could be set aside. Eno looked at the flour cakes and suddenly felt that reserving 100 acres just to plant herbs was excessive. 100 acres didn't sound like much until he converted it. About 400,000 square meters, about the size of a medieval town. Planting alone wouldn't fill it. The sanctuary couldn't easily bring in outside life. His thoughts drifted to fairy tales, tables that set themselves, cloths that conjured food, enchanted items related to sustenance. Thoughts are like dandelion seeds on the wind. You never know where they come from or where they'll land. But a sky full of drifting seeds can be intoxicating. So too were boundless imaginings. 4 years at Hogwarts had changed more than just the story around him. They had changed Eno himself. He used to worry only about daily necessities. After receiving the owl's letter, he worried about the plot of things to come. And now, perhaps there was nothing left to worry about. But when there's nothing to fret over, there's also nothing to drive you. He sat back, sinking into quiet thought, and time moved on minute by minute. A buzzing sound broke the dormitory's stillness. It came from the cabinet by the bed. The cabinet seemed to open by an invisible hand, and a 3-inch circular mirror floated up into the air. Eno froze and stared at the two-way mirror hovering there. The mirror flying over wasn't surprising. What astonished him was that it had moved by itself. Wandless and nonverbal magic. The thought hit him like a shock. He could already do wandless magic to an extent. His ice and snow magic was tied to his bloodline. But for other, more conventional spells, he still relied on a wand. And yet just now, with nothing but a thought, the cabinet had opened and the two-way mirror had come to him. Then the parchment around the butterscotch unwrapped, and the candy floated across the table too. The initial thought, I should have realized this sooner. Eno smiled as he took the floating candy and brought the two-way mirror to his face. Suddenly, it all made sense. Wandless and silent casting wasn't some abstruse theory. It was about not thinking about the wand, the words, or any gestures. It was about letting magic become so natural that it wasn't a conscious act at all. It was the same instinctive certainty that had always allowed his ice and snow magic to work, a pure belief. Simple to say, difficult to do. He remembered his old world. There, magic existed only in books and movies, bedtime stories for children. Even if real magic suddenly appeared in that world and someone was handed a wand, it would probably be useless. Belief, cognition, shaped everything. People would rationalize magic away, call it technology, a trick, something else. And once doubt crept in, the possibility faded. Hogwarts students were no different. 7 years of training had taught them that magic came from waving a wand and saying the right words. Understanding that made Eno feel unexpectedly light, and the corners of his mouth lifted. "You seem very happy?" Hermione's voice came through the two-way mirror. She had connected earlier and watched him through the glass. In the mirror, she'd seen him sitting still, lost in thought, and then begin to chuckle to himself. She'd planned to wait, but when he started to laugh, she couldn't help but speak. 312. Promise me you won't go to Harry. In the Slytherin common room, Eno leaned back in his chair, idly eating sweets and chatting with Hermione. There wasn't anything urgent to discuss. The conversation was pleasant and easy. Hermione had said it was because of Ron and Draco's argument in the Great Hall, but Eno knew that even without that spat, there would always be some excuse to talk. He didn't mind. If he couldn't be a true bystander, he might as well slip naturally into life here. While the two-way mirror finally began to work, somewhere deeper in the castle, Draco paced the underground corridor and scolded himself in silence. He'd meant to set a trap for Weasley, but while Weasley had fallen into his pit, Draco had been dragged in with him. He should have been more rational. He stared at the torchlight along the walls and sighed. 10 minutes earlier, during the argument in the Great Hall, everyone had held back, partly out of consideration for the visiting schools, and used words only. The quarrel had been aimed at Weasley at first, but it had turned into a contest of which student would be the school's champion. Draco felt a hot prickle of annoyance. He'd started it, and if the champion who represented Hogwarts turned out to be from Gryffindor, well, he didn't need to imagine how quickly he would become a target for criticism. It might not be shouted everywhere, but whispers and blame would follow. He needed a plan. A soft knock sounded at the dormitory door. 2 knocks, then a third, and the door opened from outside. Eno barely glanced up. Only the Slytherin dormitory residents and the house's head had the right to open that door. Not even the headmaster could. He hung the two-way mirror up and looked toward the doorway. Platinum blonde hair slightly mussed, head down, worry written across his face. Draco looked like an overproud dog coming home with its tail between its legs after being beaten in a fight. "What's wrong? Did someone bully Master Malfoy?" Eno teased. He'd been joking with Hermione about Draco and Ron earlier, but that had been the beginning of the talk, not the whole of it. Draco looked up as if pleading. "Eno, can you make some time?" Or, his voice trailed off. The hopeful expression on his face faded, replaced by a look of indecision. Or, "Do you have a way to make sure I become a safe champion?" "A safe champion." He repeated safe, as if to convince himself. Eno straightened. "Tell me everything." For the next 15 minutes, Draco told the story hesitantly. How he'd wagered with a few cronies, how things had escalated, what he feared would happen if Gryffindor's champion turned out to be the kind of attention Harry Potter drew. Eno listened and finally shook his head in disbelief. Draco's head always seemed to lose a few degrees of sense whenever Potter and Weasley were involved. "I can make you champion," Eno said at last, "and I can make sure you're safe, but you have to promise me one thing, no more going to Harry. From now on, as soon as you see him, you stay away." He wasn't made of stone. 4 years of living together had turned Draco into a friend of sorts. Protecting him was a reasonable request. With 3 of Voldemort's 7 Horcruxes already destroyed and 2 confiscated, and with Harry only just learning occlumency from Snape and unable to master deeper defenses so quickly, Eno had reasons to be cautious. Eno didn't forget Trelawney's prophecy. There was a sense of danger around Harry that was best avoided. "Fine, I promise," Draco said without hesitation. "I promise when I see Scarhead and his gang, I'll go out of my way to avoid them." Time passed quietly, like the falling leaves of the humping willow in autumn. The following evening, the long-prepared welcoming feast for the Triwizard Tournament finally began. The usual house banners were gone, replaced by the crests of the 3 competing schools: Hogwarts' shield, Beauxbaton's crossed wands, and Durmstrang's double-headed eagle and stag head. Draco perched at the Slytherin table, eating with the air of someone sure of himself, taking small, proud sips of pumpkin juice. Ron, meanwhile, looked unsettled. He didn't know how champions would be chosen, or whether Gryffindor would even produce one. After a day of asking around, he had little confidence. The 2 popular bets were Eno from Slytherin and Cedric from Hufflepuff. "Why didn't Percy stay back a year?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, fretting at the advantage Percy's examinations had shown. After about an hour, when the plates had been cleared away, Dumbledore rose slowly. Heads turned, excitement and tension spread through the hall. The head table was fuller than usual. Not only were the principals of the visiting schools present, but 2 high-ranking ministry officials sat among them. Ludo Bagman, head of the Department of Magical Games and Sports, and Barty Crouch, head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation. "It seems the moment has come," Dumbledore said gently. He introduced the guests to polite applause, then continued. "Next, a few words about arrangements for the Triwizard Tournament." He didn't draw out the suspense. Filch, having waited at the side of the hall, shuffled forward, struggling to carry a jewel-encrusted box. For once, the housekeeper had tried to smarten up, combing his usually messy hair and changing into a new robe, but all eyes were on the ornate box that Filch set carefully on the table. Eno's curiosity sharpened. In the original account of the tournament, the Goblet of Fire was no ordinary object. Its choice could not be altered, and any champion selected was bound by a magical contract. The consequences for refusing to compete weren't a mere slap on the wrist. If Dumbledore treated the thing so seriously, the punishment could be dreadfully severe. He had a plan. Under the cover of night, while the castle slept, he would bring a lamp to inspect the goblet. While he was at it, he could find a way to register Draco as a champion, carefully and with safeguards to keep him safe. It's the beginning of the month, and Xiao Di is asking for votes. Please cast your support. Today's share: Ever-Bashing Boomerang. I couldn't find the Wolf Fang Frisbee, so it's the boomerang Draco had in his hand today. The Ever-Bashing Boomerang is a joke product, adapted from ordinary Muggle boomerangs, an oddity recorded even in the original tale. Hogwarts, the Great Hall, filled for the banquet. Even Filch had his moment in the spotlight. Under everyone's eyes, the caretaker set the box he'd been carrying on the head table, bowed slightly, and slipped away. "I know many of you are curious about how the 3 champions will be chosen," Dumbledore said, pausing before he continued, "but I want to make clear that the whole selection will be carried out by the most impartial of arbiters." He tapped the ornate box 3 times with his wand. The box softened and dripped away like wax under heat, revealing an ancient, unassuming goblet. "An impartial selection," Dumbledore announced. "The champions of the 3 schools will be chosen by the Goblet of Fire." As of now, the Goblet of Fire has been lit. The Triwizard Tournament is, at this moment, unavoidable. With that, the goblet spat up blue-white flames, bright and dazzling. Those wishing to compete Those interested in putting their name forward, please write your name and your school on parchment after the banquet and cast it into the goblet of fire. You will have 24 hours to decide. Tonight, the goblet will remain in the entrance hall. Dumbledore's gaze swept across the sea of students. His eyes were serious, grave. One final reminder. Once your name is selected by the Goblet of Fire, there is no going back, no retreat, no regret. Even the most boisterous students fell silent. Dumbledore seemed to want that effect. He let the silence settle, then added quietly, "If chosen, you form an unbreakable contract with the goblet. All champions must persevere to the end, unless, of course, you die in the attempt." The mention of death made every head in the Great Hall snap up. Not only Hogwarts students, but the visiting pupils from Bowtons and Durmstrang wore serious expressions. Eno's eyes flickered with thought, but his mind ran a different track from the obvious. The age limit, 17, had been dropped. That was a small change, but significant. Logically, it made sense. The Goblet of Fire was a high-grade magical artifact. It wouldn't nominate someone unworthy. If a first year were chosen, it would prove that first year's abilities exceeded everyone else at Hogwarts. Preventing them from competing would be the truly irresponsible act, putting personal caution above a fair and impartial judgment. The goblet didn't lie. Once that thought loosened its grip, Eno's speculation deepened. Peel back the layers of the original story, and a different picture emerged. Dumbledore had known more than he let on. The age restriction, the monitoring through the castle portraits, his calmness as Barty Crouch Sr. tampered with the goblet. All of it could have been calculated to protect a particular boy. To save Harry, perhaps, or more coldly, to force Lord Voldemort to confront whatever remnant of himself remained. But human plans have flaws. Even the best-laid schemes break in small, unforeseen ways. Cedric's death was the black swan that no one had anticipated. No matter how meticulous a plan, it would contain loopholes, just like the Time Turner or even the Philosopher's Stone. Those were human creations and therefore imperfect. Dumbledore's love for the castle and its students might have driven him further than most would imagine. Maybe the whole series of events, every manipulation and cover, left him with a burden that finally cracked something inside him. Perhaps that guilt and grief led him to reckless desperation later, to touch things he should not have touched. While Eno traced those possibilities in silence, Dumbledore resumed speaking. The 3 tasks, a panel of 5 judges to ensure fairness, and the glory and prize that awaited the winner. The words glory and 1,000 galleons had the intended effect. The earlier gravity evaporated, conversation and laughter surged back through the hall like warm wind. At the Gryffindor table, Ron was practically beside himself. 1,000 galleons, a whole 1,000, he gushed. Merlin's socks, imagine how heavy that'd be. Ron's mind quickly went to vaults and the family's finances. Bill and Charlie had steady jobs, Percy was becoming respectable in his internship, and Fred and George were famously flush. Ron had watched his brothers prosper, now he felt glaringly poor by comparison. Even Ginny had more than he did. It stung. It wasn't only Ron. 1,000 galleons was an enormous sum for many of the students and their families. Excitement buzzed around the hall like living energy. Dumbledore waited until the din had simmered down, then spread his hands and gently pressed them downward. All right, what needed to be said has been said. The rest of the evening is yours. Before you go, one more thing. The decision of the Goblet of Fire cannot be altered. As he spoke, the professors and foreign guests rose to leave. The 2 senior ministry officials at the head table departed briskly. Barty Crouch Sr. looked suddenly pallid, as if he'd been drained of blood. He wobbled and nearly stumbled as he left. For the moment, no one seemed to notice him. The glowing goblet had everyone's attention. The hall erupted again. If the enchanted ceiling had been anything but rock solid, the noise might have lifted it. Eno smiled at the uproar. This was the Hogwarts he loved, a castle alive with laughter. He tapped the table idly, and a glass of freshly squeezed grass juice materialized before him, the house doing its small domestic magics. He was just raising it when someone greeted him clumsily from beside him. "Hello, that performance the other day. Very good." Crumb's smile was faint but genuine. He'd recognized Eno long ago. The chant from the World Cup match had stuck in his memory. "Thank you. Your Quidditch is impressive as well, Eno replied, matching the friendliness. They exchanged brief, polite words, and Krum sat. Are you putting your name into the goblet? He asked. I expect you could win Hogwarts Place without trouble. Someone once said that everything in the world is relative. Black and white, good and evil, even noise and silence stand opposed and yet cohere. Even in the boisterous great hall, there are quiet corners, the Slytherin table among them. When Krum sat down beside Eno, he was surprised to find that none of the autograph seekers from earlier had followed him. He knew it wasn't because his fame had faded. People simply kept their distance when a professor was present. The same had happened at Durmstrang, especially after the World Cup. Admiration rose, but it was tempered by respect. Krum took the chance to study the young man next to him. Eno wore a plain robe, but it seemed cut for him. Short black hair, a dark green collar, an air of composed mystery. When Eno noticed Krum looking, he turned his head slightly. If it's just to chat, I think time's almost up, he said. We have class tomorrow. Krum, who had not been subtle, stopped wasting time. It's about film mirrors. I want to introduce them at Durmstrang. As a professional Quidditch seeker, Krum knew how short a sporting career could be. He wanted to use his fame before graduation to secure his future. Eno waved a hand and refused outright. Though the mirrors were his and he was the major shareholder, a board had been set up. Some things couldn't be handled informally. You should talk to the person in charge, not me, he said. Krum hurried on, ignoring the language barrier, explaining his idea and the general plan. No response? Eno frowned. Despite Krum's halting English, he grasped the key point. With Krum's fame, especially after that spectacular World Cup, letters wouldn't normally go unanswered. It was as if a top Muggle footballer asked a luxury firm for an endorsement and was simply ignored. Eno ran through possibilities in seconds, but with no evidence, he kept his opinion to himself. Thank you. I understand. I'll give you a definite answer before Halloween. There was nothing more to add. Krum said goodbye and left. Eno rose as well and walked out of the Great Hall. Draco chose to follow him. In a hall this large, people coming and going was common, but when the people leaving were notable, it was noticed. The conversation between Eno and Krum had drawn attention. Beyond the Irish team's honor, the 422nd Quidditch World Cup had especially raised their profiles. Heads turned at the Gryffindor and Ravenclaw tables, and even at Beauxbatons. The Hufflepuffs, meanwhile, kept eating and making merry. Beneath the castle, the corridor to the Slytherin common room felt colder, perhaps because so many people were gathered above. Draco followed Eno in silence. He didn't know what had happened, but it was clearly not pleasant, and staying quiet was the wiser course. At the common room entrance, they gave the password, the wall opened, and they went through to the dormitory. Draco, have you been keeping up with the film mirror business? Eno asked once they were seated. Draco was puzzled for a moment, but then realized something must have gone wrong elsewhere. This was not a small matter. He answered without hesitation. I haven't managed the operations. I invested 10,000 galleons and provided a 900-square-foot shop in Diagon Alley. Other than that, I haven't paid much attention, and he rattled off everything he knew. Dividends, gossip, the little details. Eno listened calmly. Draco's account seemed honest enough, which eased him. Help me write a letter to Marcus, Eno said. Call everyone involved. We need a meeting next weekend. And invite those who only collect dividends. They can come too. I'll write it now. Draco nodded, then asked, where should we hold it? The Diagon Alley shop or Malfoy Manor? Diagon Alley shop. This isn't a banquet. We don't need a lot of space. Eno chose the shop. Some things shouldn't always be handled at someone else's manor. The conversation also reminded him it might be time to buy one himself. He had plenty of money now. He'd even opened a vault at Gringotts for dividends, though he hadn't managed it much since. He wasn't sure of the exact sum, but it was certainly not small. After the business was settled, the dormitory quieted. Draco hunched over his desk to write the letters and replayed a conversation with his father from before term began. Galleons have magic, but as the heir of the Malfoys, the first thing you must learn is to refuse greed. Those words still echoed. At the time, Draco hadn't thought much of them. Now, as he signed each missive, it seemed the Galleons truly did have their own kind of magic. 3:15. Midnight Encounter, The Secret of the Goblet of Fire. Night fell, and the moonlight spilled across the grounds like a soft, mysterious dust of silver. Hogwarts, Beauxbaton's carriage, and Durmstrang's ship all sank into silence. Only the occasional hoot of an owl and the whisper of wind in the trees broke the stillness. Deep into the night, in the great hall's side room, the huge chamber lay empty beneath its vaulted ceiling. Only the ancient goblet of fire burned at the center, its blue-white flames licking quietly. The light was neither hot nor cold, but shot through with an uncanny, inscrutable quality. In that hush, the castle and the cup seemed to trade the secrets of past and future. The hush did not last. A red glow flared and a figure materialized, carrying an oil lamp. With Corvus's help, Eno had come alone to the great hall. The sight of the solitary cup burning in that vacant space tempted him with the urge to take a photograph. He acted on it at once. He vanished, but this time he did not call on the Phoenix's power. He slipped back to Shelter Valley and returned with an instant camera, a gift Newt had given him in America and rarely used until now. Click. The camera made a soft sound, and Eno had a photograph of the Goblet of Fire. He hung the camera around his neck and stepped closer with the lamp. The lamp's small orange flame stood its ground against the goblet's blue-white blaze, casting a warm circle of light. Under that glow, Eno could clearly see the intricate alchemical arrays engraved on the goblet's bronze surface. They were complex, but their structure suggested two interwoven systems rising from the base in a double helix pattern. Now that he had some grounding in alchemy and ancient runes, Eno could read more of their meaning. The two bands of runes served separate functions. One set seemed to perform identification and filtering, while the other bore the dark mark of a curse, unmistakably tied to the dark arts. Seeing that, Eno hesitated about his earlier plan. Could he consign that burden to Draco? In stories, being the protagonist does not spare others from pain. Harry's safety wouldn't guarantee the safety of those dragged into the consequences. Faced with the goblet's centuries-old craft and the curse woven into it, he changed his mind. He did not want to be the hand of fate, nor to be propelled by it. He took a dozen more pictures from different angles, making certain he had every detail recorded. The side room filled with a soft series of clicks before he finally put the camera down. Just as he had finished and was about to leave, another figure entered the room. "I thought you would put in a name, or even confund the goblet," came a dry voice. "But only photographs. That surprises me." Albus Dumbledore stood there in a blue nightgown and a slightly ridiculous moon-shaped cap. Eno, having been granted a measure of the headmaster's authority, was not surprised to see how quietly Dumbledore could appear. He had come to understand the old wizard's subtle control over the castle. Still, he answered Dumbledore's sigh without hiding his earlier intentions. "I thought so at first, and I even had a name ready." He withdrew the scrap of parchment with Draco Malfoy's name on it, and, with a flick of thought, sent it sailing toward Dumbledore. "But after I looked more closely at the goblet, I changed my mind. I don't want to be the hand of fate. I won't be pushed forward by it. I'm keeping a record instead." Dumbledore took the flying parchment with a careful, wandless levitation. That single silent charm, wordless and wandless, would be beyond the skill of 99% of wizards. He glanced at the name, and with the soft gravity that made him both infuriating and irresistible, said, "Those who are willing, fate leads forward. Those who resist, fate pushes. And then there are those who walk hand in hand with it." It was one of those small, trenchant truths Dumbledore favored. Eno let it settle. After a long beat, he smiled and teased the old man. "I didn't imagine fate would be something you could argue about. I thought that was the diviner's territory." Dumbledore's face went wistful. "Exclusive to diviners? I once had a diviner friend," he said quietly. Hearing that, Eno felt the color drain from his teasing. He'd forgotten for a moment whatever shadow lay over that friend in Nurmengard. Using someone's sorrow as a joke had been thoughtless, especially with a man over 100 years old. He shifted topics instead. "Professor, if we can delay this a little longer, I think Professor McGonagall would make an excellent choice." Dumbledore nodded gently. "I don't deny Minerva's devotion, nor her competence, but you know what she values." "All right, you're probably right." Eno accepted the point with a rueful smile. Walking with fate, perhaps, was as valid a path as resisting it. He pulled a notebook from his pocket, tore off a page, wrote a name, and dropped it into the goblet of fire. This time, the name he wrote was Minerva McGonagall. The blue-white flames surged as the goblet took the paper. An orange spark flashed at the edges and was gone. "I should go to bed," Dumbledore said, "and I sincerely advise elderly people not to keep themselves up too late." As he spoke, Corvus alighted on Eno's shoulder. A red shimmer flared, and Eno vanished. Left alone in the quiet side room, Dumbledore stood for a long time watching the strange, steady light. His eyes were distant, lost in thought, as the little blue flames whispered their ancient secrets into the night. The next morning, Eno's internal clock woke him. He opened his eyes, slipped quietly out of bed, and found the air in Shelter Valley damp and earthy, the scent of freshly watered soil telling him that Blue Lantern had just finished its rounds. After washing up in the Valley House, he went to the path that had once been capped in ice and snow. He rarely came here now that the valley existed, but the ice flower and the snow and ice anaconda had been his earliest companions. With nothing pressing to do, he took a slow, lazy walk and circled the area. The red maple trees lining the path, whose leaves still carried the written stories of the Arad continent, rustled as he approached, their text-laden leaves swaying like old friends greeting him after a long absence. He reached out and patted one of the trunks, a quiet return greeting. The ice flower and the anaconda responded as well. He hadn't paid much attention to the anaconda for a long time. It had grown considerably, now nearly 70 feet long. Its ice-blue body, scaled texture, and inscrutable expression made it look utterly cold-blooded and implacable. Snakes seem different when they lift their heads, and this one was no exception. When it stopped moving and raised itself, its head towered over 6 meters high, and looking up at it always triggered an involuntary megalophobia, the oppressive sense of something overwhelmingly huge. Those feelings mattered only for strangers. In Sanctuary, Eno had absolute control over the creature. It was a construct of ice and snow, not of free will. He ignored it and went on to the ice flower. The seedling that had once barely broken the soil was now a lush plant over 2 feet tall, as pure and elegant as a crafted sculpture. More strikingly, it had produced an ice-blue bud. The plant's maturity, while surprising, made sense. 10 years in Middle-earth had accelerated growth for many of the valley's magical herbs. This flower, one of Sanctuary's earliest plants, had had far more time than that. When he reached out and touched the ice flower's leaves, a flood of information washed into him. After all this time, he understood the plant much better. He had guessed before that it might be a magical item intended for escape. Now, after the bud formed, the flower confirmed it. It was a contingency for revival or escape. It explained how the former White Witch had achieved a kind of revival, but also why that revival had been flawed. The simultaneous appearance of Lena and the White Witch at the blacksmith's in Rohan, which he had once chalked up to magic, now made sense as an artifact of the flower's method. The difference was in personality. One was a monarch who had ruled Narnia for centuries. The other, while similarly aloof, lacked regal presence. They were like the same actor playing Merlin and King Arthur, memories aligned, but the essential bearing different. He'd once thought Sanctuary's control had eroded the White Witch's original self. Now he saw a different picture. The flower's effect was more like a mundane cloning chamber. The White Witch was Lena, and Lena was not the White Witch. Two sides of the same coin, with identical memories, but not identical being. Eno stroked the leaves and sighed at fate's impermanence. Even so, he could not deny the ice flower's power. For those who had lost family, lovers, or parents, for those the magical world still held its dead as souls, the plant offered hope. There was no doubt souls existed here. Ghosts at Hogwarts, Harry seeing Dumbledore at King's Cross, Voldemort's infant remnant, the brief returns of parents and fallen friends. Too much evidence had accumulated. If souls could be tied to the ice flower's process, its imperfections might be fixed, not just reproducing memories, but restoring continuity at the soul level. He ran through laws and examples in his head. Gamp's law of elemental transfiguration, Goblot's third law, the assertion that magic could not truly bring back the dead. Yet where magic failed, fairy tales might hold answers. A quick calculation followed. planted in the summer of his first year, producing buds after the start of his fourth, visiting 5 fantasy worlds in between, and 10 years at the end in Middle-earth. He worked it out and realized the cycle to produce a bud had taken nearly 20 years, and the plant still wasn't fully mature. Time could be waited out. That wasn't the fatal problem. The harder obstacle was Sanctuary's mechanism. No matter how powerful the craft, control over an awakened or restored being seemed inevitable. Still, compared to the pain of permanent separation, that control felt like a minor flaw, something negotiable if both parties were willing. "This really is a big surprise," he murmured, standing. What had been meant as a casual walk had yielded something far greater. Fate, he thought, was like Bertie Bott's every flavor beans. You never knew what the next one would taste like. He had once imagined that when the ice flower bloomed, a beautiful flower fairy would appear. Life, of course, had a way of refusing such neat endings. 317. An invitation from Madame Maxime. After leaving the sanctuary and returning to his dormitory, Eno pulled back the bed curtains and glanced at the alarm clock. 7:50 a.m. He had unconsciously spent nearly an hour in Shelter Valley. Draco was still fast asleep. Eno looked at him for a moment, then left the dormitory. Hogwarts kitchens served breakfast between 8 and 9, and although he technically held the authority of a principal, Eno had no intention of abusing it. He was still a student and should behave like one. Rules and appearances mattered. Besides, in any story, a principal who never followed the rules became unbearable. He arrived at the Great Hall just in time. The 4 house tables were already full. He sat at the Slytherin table, and almost immediately, a standard breakfast appeared in front of him. The spread was surprisingly generous. French croissants with jam and honey, breakfast rolls made from flatbread with egg, bacon, and vegetables, served with salad and ketchup for contrast, and a sliced French sandwich layered with butter, cheese, a fried egg, and crisp lettuce. It all looked delicious. Eno sighed inwardly at the presentation, picked up his cutlery, and began to eat. Time passed quietly. When he finished the last bite of his sandwich and dabbed his mouth with a napkin, he felt numerous eyes turn toward him at once. He set the napkin down and lifted his head. A tall girl was approaching with effortless grace, and the gazes followed her every step. Unbelievable, completely spineless, he thought helplessly. He didn't need to guess who she was. Fleur Delacour, the famed beauty from Beauxbatons. What bothered him was the behavior of the Hogwarts boys, their eyes glued to her, disguising their staring with furtive bites and obvious handkerchief pretend wipes. If they liked her, fine. Admiring beauty wasn't wrong, but pretending not to look was laughable. The only consolation was that everyone was doing it, so no one could mock another. Fleur's attention was fixed on the table opposite. When she saw him look up, she returned a gentle smile and approached. "Good morning, Mr. Swinburne. I'm sorry to interrupt your meal." Her English carried that slight, charming French lilt. It wasn't perfect, but it suited her. "Good morning, miss," Eno replied calmly, looking her in the face. She wasn't as exaggeratedly stunning as some described, but she was undeniably pretty. Her slim figure and waist-length silvery hair made her both mysterious and striking. As he watched her, Fleur watched him too. Their eyes met, and she found no trace of infatuation in his gaze, only appreciation, and it seemed more directed at her hair than at her as a conquest. That disappointed her slightly, but it also reminded her of something her grandmother once said: when a person cannot be tempted, cannot be offended, and cannot be easily swayed, there is something charming about him. 17-year-old Fleur, with more worldly experience than the proverb might suggest, politely looked away after that brief contact. Staring at a stranger was not proper, even in open romantic France. "My name is Fleur. Fleur Delacour," she added as she sat. "Professor Maxime asked me to deliver this to you." She produced a delicate envelope and laid it on the table. "Thank you," Eno said, nodding. Madame Maxime's letter didn't surprise him. As principal of Beauxbatons, she wouldn't normally meet the legendary alchemist, but with Nicolas occupied dealing with his legacy, contact made sense. "The letter's been delivered. If there's nothing else, I'll take my leave," Fleur said with a small smile. She was curious about the boy in front of her, but proud as she was, she left nothing further unsaid. Eno stood to see her off. "Thank you again, Miss Delacour." He had no intention of entangling himself with Fleur, not out of fear or dislike, but because of a deeply ingrained English reserve. A very charming 17-year-old from France was a different world. Life wasn't a fairy tale, and innocence was rare. After Fleur left, the glances around the hall shifted back to other things. Eno smiled inwardly and picked up the envelope. The handwriting was neat, formal cursive English, surprisingly good. For a moment he had thought to find a French translator, but the letter wasn't long. As he read, Madame Maxime's intention became clear. A few minutes later, he set the paper down and murmured, "As expected." Nicolas must have spoken with her. Otherwise, the polite, almost solicitous tone and the subtle invitation throughout would have been out of character for the dignified Beauxbatons principal. The invitation was understated but unmistakable. She was offering him the chance to come to Beauxbatons, promising that after graduation he would be given a direct appointment as an alchemy professor. Madame Maxime was sincere, but Hogwarts had already moved faster. He would refuse the offer, but he planned to take a different course. Meet the half-giant principal in person and, as he had promised, make a copy of the books Nicholas had left behind to present to Beauxbatons. After the last herbology class that afternoon, Eno drifted out of the greenhouse with the rest of the Slytherins. Of all his lessons, only herbology and potions felt like they taught him anything new. Transfiguration, charms, even the elective ancient runes, all seemed like a poor use of time. Still, they were students first and foremost, and the dull routine of school life was the sort of thing people looked back on with fondness years later. Maybe because the champions were to be announced that evening, everyone quickened their steps back toward the castle. Time moved quickly. Although the feast was at 8, by 7 the castle corridors had emptied. Everyone was in the great hall or in groups elsewhere, talking, playing wizard's chess or gobstones. No one was idle. Draco sat at the Slytherin table, loud and smug, glancing toward the Gryffindor table every so often. He had been worried before, but whatever pressure had been on him had eased, and now he made the most of it, eating, drinking, and boasting. His relaxed, triumphant air drew looks from the others. "What's with him? Like a dog let off its leash," Daphne said, bemused. "He's just relieved," Pansy chuckled. "With that whole betting mess, you can read him like an open book. No pressure now, and he's enjoying it." Pansy glanced over at the other side of the hall. Eno felt the look and returned a faint smile, then turned his head to the person beside him. Moments later, he overheard something ridiculous. Draco, assuming he had the upper hand, was planning to take Goyle and Crabbe over to jeer at Ron. It was the sort of petty triumphalism Eno had come to expect. If it came to blows, though, Professor McGonagall would not be lenient. At the mere mention of her name, Draco's swagger seemed to evaporate, his confidence flattening visibly. Across the hall, someone else was in a good mood. Hermione chatted cheerfully with her roommate Parvati, joining in talk she usually avoided. Parvati was surprised. Hermione wasn't normally interested in idle gossip. I don't usually listen to this stuff," Hermione said, smiling. "It's just, I'm happy about something." Earlier that day, a chance encounter in the corridor had given Hermione a glimpse of Eno's thoughts, and that small knowledge buoyed her unexpectedly. She planned to brew extra useful potions before the competition and find a way to send them to him. At 8 o'clock, as heads of house and ministry officials took their places, the great hall fell quiet. Dumbledore rose from the head table and, as if anticipating everyone's impatience, skipped any long prelude. He waved his wand. Hundreds of candles guttered, and the goblet of fire floated in from the side chamber, settling on the table. Its blue-white flames flared, and then shifted, surging 3 feet high and whitening into a dazzling orange-red. Sparks flew, and a half-scorched piece of parchment shot out and fluttered to the desk. Dumbledore caught the slip and read it aloud. "The Durmstrang champion, Victor Krum." The hall erupted. "Mr. Krum, please wait in the room next door," Dumbledore directed, nodding toward a door behind the head table. Krum stood and left amid thunderous applause. Not long after, the goblet spat another slip. "Beauxbatons, Fleur Delacour," Dumbledore announced. The applause for Fleur was enthusiastic, if not quite as loud as it had been for Krum. The Hogwarts boys, however, clapped vigorously. When she rose and walked gracefully between the tables, her silvery hair catching the torchlight, many eyes followed until her lithe figure disappeared behind the door. With the foreign champions called, all attention turned to Hogwarts. The flames in the goblet flared again. This time the slip was plainly a lined piece of notebook paper, a detail only noticeable close up. Dumbledore's face betrayed a small, pleased smile as he picked it up and read. Finally, the Hogwarts champion. He cleared his throat and read the name on the page, Eno Swinburne. Applause crashed over him, louder than for either of the other two. At the head table, Professor McGonagall's eyes widened and her mouth fell open. Then, quietly, almost to herself, and with more excitement than she intended to show, she muttered, "Ha! I knew it. He wouldn't give up." Eno stood and walked through the cheering toward the head table. Halfway to the doorway, the goblet's flames shifted color again. He stopped, glancing back at the goblet and then toward the head table. The moment felt heavy with implication, as if fate itself had paused to breathe. It puzzled him. Mad-Eye Moody had been on duty. The other adults had shown nothing unusual. The goblet was supposed to take its time in the original telling, weeks, not hours, but here the process had completed in a single day. He didn't believe anyone would brazenly tamper with it, not here, not now. He had even been in the side chamber with Dumbledore late last night. Nothing had seemed amiss. A thought he had considered impossible flitted into his mind, sudden and unwelcome. The memory of last night's mention of Confundus came back in sharp focus. No wonder Confundo was mentioned last night, he thought, and for a moment the applause and chatter of the great hall faded around him. 319, the Fourth Warrior. As the fourth piece of parchment sailed out of the goblet, Eno finally had his answer. Suddenly, a string of past details fit together. Over the summer, the remaining 2 Horcruxes of Lord Voldemort had been recovered. After term began, Mad-Eye Moody had taken up the post of gamekeeper, and Harry's progress with occlumency had accelerated. At first glance, none of these things seemed related, but the connections were there if you looked closely. Eno was now convinced that the accidental meeting the night before had been a beautiful misunderstanding. Perhaps Dumbledore had planned something clandestine under Moonlight, and someone else had simply beaten him to it. The only question that remained was whether last night's impromptu change had been part of the headmaster's design, or whether it wouldn't matter to the plan, whoever the champion turned out to be. With that niggling doubt, Eno pushed open the door. The room beyond was modest and rectangular, simply furnished. A fabric sofa, a few high-backed chairs, a tall round table. 2 three-pronged wall candelabras gave off a faint, dim light, making the place feel a little threadbare. Eno had to fight back a wry thought about Hogwarts expenditures. It reminded him of that dark, rickety boat ride on their first year, where they hadn't even bothered with a proper lamp. A slightly unfamiliar English voice broke his musing. "Mr. Swinburne." Fleur, though she'd arrived late, was the first to react. She stood immediately and smiled a warm greeting. Crumb rose a half-beat later, clapping him on the shoulder. "I knew it. Great. We're on the same stage again." Crumb's plain, hearty speech and broad smile won goodwill easily. Even his casual, same-stage phrasing lent an air of camaraderie. Eno found it mildly amusing. A man who could plan 10 years ahead and, when thwarted, grumble elegantly about unrequited advances was hardly as simple as he seemed. And then there was the Goblet of Fire itself. Without outside interference, it had always been fair. It was reasonable to assume the 3 named champions, representing 3 of Europe's oldest schools, were all impressive talents. Beauxbatons and Durmstrang simply sent fewer students, so hidden excellence could be easy to miss. As Crumb's words died away, Eno replied politely, "I'm honored to be a champion with you both, Miss Delacour, Mr. Crumb." They chatted amiably in the small room. Back in the great hall, however, the mood had turned eerie. Silence, a heavy, stunned silence, fell over the hall after the goblet spat out the 4th scrap of parchment. Not a whisper from the students, not a murmur at the high table. Everyone was frozen, as if no one had expected this. Dumbledore took the parchment into his hand, frozen for a heartbeat by his own surprise, then read the name aloud, Harry Potter. No house prefix, just the name, and no one was thinking about the technicalities. All attention had turned to Harry. There was no applause, no cheering. The The silence slowly loosened into a buzz of confused conversation. Faces turned toward him in disbelief. Neville, Ron, and many others. The expressions were uncannily similar. Blank shock. "This has nothing to do with me," Harry blurted, bewildered and defensive. Anyone would have suspected foul play under these circumstances, and Harry was no exception. "We all know that," Ron said too quickly, forcing a smile that barely covered his unease. "But this is good news, Harry. Congratulations." He sounded bitterly proud of a friend who was suddenly at the center of a storm. "This isn't about congratulations. Haven't you noticed there's a problem?" Harry snapped, voice sharp enough that his eyes reddened. Heads at the high table turned. Snape's brow knit into a frown. Professor McGonagall stood with a look of alarm and strode toward Dumbledore. Unlike Eno, whose strength and reputation were public, McGonagall was utterly unconvinced at the idea of Harry as a tournament champion. The idea seemed outlandish to her. But she knew duty and safety had to come first. Dumbledore rose to meet her, calm but firm. "Minerva, please, listen. This needs to be discussed, but not now." Then, fixing his gaze on the stunned boy, he said, "Harry Potter, please go to the room next to the Great Hall." The words seemed to wake Harry from a daze. He left his seat and stumbled toward the back of the hall, every eye on him. For a moment, he felt like a stranger in a place he'd always called home. As he rose and walked away, the hall finally erupted into conversation. Hufflepuffs, especially, whispered and fretted. They'd been bitterly disappointed when Cedric wasn't chosen, but there was little they could say now that their champion was Eno Swinburne. Eno's record spoke for itself. Last year's encounters with Dementors, the Blue Phoenix, the Quidditch World Cup, and the Red Phoenix, all had shown his excellence and even earned detailed coverage in the Daily Prophet. Harry, by contrast, had been hailed as the boy who lived, but had done little spectacular in the years since his first year. His grades were ordinary, and the only thing he could genuinely boast about was Quidditch, and that achievement was now dwarfed by a professional World Cup seeker. When the chatter grew too loud, Dumbledore's voice, amplified by magic, cut through the hall. "Silence!" The wave of sound rolled over everyone and hushed them. "There has been an unexpected development. We will sort this out. Dinner is concluded. Prefects, lead your houses back to your common rooms in an orderly fashion." At the headmaster's words, prefects from every house rose to their feet. Harry pushed open the wooden door that led to the room off the hall and was met by a circle of curious, startled faces. He felt exposed and awkward, but not all the looks were hostile. Eno stood, moving toward him with a steady kindness. "Harry, don't worry. Professor Dumbledore will handle this," he said softly. Others might not have understood the urgency in Eno's voice, but he did. Harry was a lit fuse, volatile and raw, and whatever happened next could set off anything. 320. Disagreement. Showmanship. Compromise. The dark room at the back of the Great Hall felt smaller than it should have. When Harry walked in, Eno immediately moved to comfort him. Harry accepted it gratefully. The tension he'd been holding in finally began to ease. In this timeline, unlike the one he remembered, most of Voldemort's Horcruxes had already been destroyed. Only the diary had been left when Voldemort returned. At the Triwizard Tournament, Voldemort had used Harry's blood to regain his body, creating a dangerous link, but even that danger had been altered. 3 of the Horcruxes were gone before Voldemort could fully exploit his connection, and Trelawney's prophecy, whatever its truth, had everyone on edge. "Thank you, Eno," Harry murmured, nodding. His voice was low and slightly thin, either from his changing voice or from his drained mood, and the tone made the footsteps of a certain professor falter as he crossed the floor. "You're right. Professor Dumbledore will sort it out," Eno said. "Don't worry." "It is all right, child," Dumbledore called reassuringly as he stepped through the doorway with a cluster of others. The arguing that had floated up from the corridor stopped as a parade of faces filled the room. Dumbledore, Madame Maxime, Karkaroff, 2 senior ministry officials, Professor McGonagall, and Snape, his expression unreadable and oddly composed. Harry felt himself relax further when Eno called softly, "Corvus." A warm flash of orange light announced the Phoenix, whose small lamp-like form brightened the dim room. The glow chased away some of the gloom. Even Fleur, who until then had been staring fixedly at the sudden bird, allowed herself to breathe. Crumb's smile never faded. He simply looked on with the same quiet sincerity he always did. The interruption broke up a louder exchange in the doorway. "Albus, I demand an explanation," a voice had said. "Yes, I will explain," Dumbledore began. But before they could listen further, Karkaroff cut in the instant he entered. "I want an explanation now. I regret coming to Hogwarts. This is meant to be a fair tournament, and yet Hogwarts has been anything but fair." Madame Maxime, though seated because of her height, gave a slight but unmistakable nod that lent weight to his complaint. Dumbledore looked a little more frail than usual as he listened. He wore a smile, but it was the kind that didn't quite hide worry. Eno watched the exchange. He knew much of the performance in the corridor was theater, but Karkaroff's tone grated on him nonetheless. He rose and crossed to stand before the three visiting heads, and the room fell quiet. Dumbledore inclined his head courteously. Madame Maxime returned the gesture. Karkaroff paused mid-complaint, waiting with thinly veiled impatience for whatever answer Eno might give. "Professors," Eno said calmly, keeping his eyes on Karkaroff, "the Goblet of Fire's decision cannot be altered by argument. Harry must take part in all the tasks." Karkaroff opened his mouth, but Eno went on before he could speak. "However, as Professor Dumbledore reminded us, the Goblet's results are judged by 5 judges. Hogwarts has invited an extra champion. To preserve fairness, I propose we take the average of Harry's score and mine as the final result for any judged portion." He did not stop there to plead his case with words alone. To add weight to his proposal, Eno reached past the 3 principals and snapped his fingers. The candelabra on the wall split into 2 faint flames that drifted through the air and, to everyone's eyes, turned into snowflakes. As the flakes settled, 2 high-backed chairs embossed with the Hogwarts crest manifested where the flames had settled. It was a precise, elegant display of wandless, non-verbal magic. Levitation, elemental transmutation, transfiguration, interwoven so smoothly it looked effortless. The room took in the show in silence. Professor McGonagall's face held a small, proud smile. Transfiguration had been key to what had just been performed, and she read the spellcraft as readily as a sentence. Karkaroff, who had expected a fight, found himself diffused by the demonstration. Madame Maxime's expression softened. The public confrontation she had clearly been ready to back away from when faced with such confidence. Snape, who had lingered by the doorway, moved quietly to a chair and sat. He had been the one to slow his steps the moment he heard Harry's weak reply earlier, and now he watched everything with that same unreadable, intent attention. Eno bowed slightly and returned to his place. His calm solution and the show of mastery had shifted the mood. Dumbledore's shoulders relaxed, relief showed on his face. Madame Maxime's approval was obvious. Karkaroff, who had come intending to make an accusation, stood silent, the fight drained from him as if he had been outmaneuvered rather than overruled. Harry felt better, enough to offer a small, grateful smile, and Eno allowed himself to sit again, and the Corvus settling against his shoulder like a living ember. The dispute had not been ended by force, but by compromise and a measure of showmanship that preserved Hogwarts' reputation and, for now, the fairness of the tournament.